Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a quick look at a replacement power supply unit for the Commodore 64. While some Commodore enthusiasts opt to build their own PSU, I'm going to save myself a little time and try out one of the Commodore 64 replacement PSUs provided by Keylog. Let's dive in. Here we have a really old and grungy original Commodore 64 PSU. I've had this PSU for many years and have been using it for a couple of my Commodore 64 computers. This is a solid PSU that feels like a brick when you pick it up. This is partially due to the 9-volt transformer inside the PSU. The majority of the rest of the weight comes from the epoxy Commodore used to fill the gaps within the PSU. This was done, presumably, to dissipate the heat better than air can, and it acts as a great electrical insulator. Density aside, the weighted Commodore 64 PSUs has, historically at least, been the least of its problems. For the unaware, the Commodore 64 power supply provides two sets of voltages, 9 volts AC and 5 volts DC. The 9 volts AC is provided by a transformer and is sent directly to the Commodore 64 through the power cable. Separately, the 9 volts AC is sent through a voltage regulator that produces the 5 volts DC needed by the 64. It is the 5-volt regulator circuit that has a history of failing, and when it fails, it doesn't simply stop providing power, it tends to let through the higher voltages. This has the potential to fry many of the hard-to-find parts on your Commodore 64's motherboard. Knowing this, I have been very careful to frequently test the output lines on my Commodore 64 power supply before plugging it into any of my computers. I have toyed around with the idea of building a custom power supply, but just haven't taken the time since I tend to have too many projects going on at a given time. I'm sure many of you can probably relate. That said, I get more and more nervous every time I use this old power supply unit and have decided it's time to purchase an aftermarket PSU for my coveted Commodore 64s. With a bit of research, I found there are several providers of aftermarket PSUs for the Commodore 64s as well as several other vintage computers. I don't recall which YouTube creator I was watching. I watch a lot. But they were using a power supply from Keylog. After a quick search, I ended up ordering a new PSU for about $60 US with free shipping. Although this was being shipped from Poland to the United States, I received the PSU about a week later. After opening the box and taking out the PSU, the first thing I noticed was its weight. It is so light compared to the original power supply. Of course, this power supply isn't full of epoxy and has modern components dropping the weight considerably. Looking at the pins on the plug, this also has more pins than my original power supply. My original one only had 4. I assume this is because the PSU can also be used with some of the newer VIC-20s that use the same Commodore 64 style power socket. The model that I opted for has a built-in OLED display and touch sensor that cycles the display through one of 3 modes. Tap it once to see runtime and total operation time, more on that in a moment. Tap it again to turn the display off, and finally tap it once more to go back to the original display showing voltage and runtime. Notice that it only displays the 5-volt DC level. I'm assuming this is because the 9-volt AC line is coming through a transformer, which is less likely to fault in a way that causes damage to the computer. The PSU also remembers which mode the display was in when you unplug it and plug it back in. That's nice. Okay, time to plug this in and see if it works with my Commodore 64. Coincidentally, I just happen to have a Commodore 64 sitting next to me. Let's get it plugged in. The plug fits nicely without any wiggliness. Okay, let's turn it on. Boots just fine with tens of thousands of bytes of imagination at our fingertips. Let's enter a quick line of basic code. Nice, all seems to be working as expected. Okay, I've now had this PSU plugged in and running continuously for 11 hours and 19 minutes. You can see this on the top line of the OLED display. This is an ephemeral timer and is reset every time you unplug the power supply. The bottom line of the display shows the total operation time of the power supply unit. In other words, the total amount of time this PSU has been powered up for the life of the PSU. This timer is not reset when you unplug it because the time is stored in non-volatile memory within the PSU itself. That's pretty cool. This has been running for about a day and a half with the Commodore 64 plugged in and running for much of that time, and the PSU is still running super cool. You can get a hint of warmth coming from it if you hold your hands close to the vents. All in all, I am very pleased with this new power supply so far. Naturally, the real proof will be in its longevity. I'll only know over time how well this PSU does and how long it'll last, but I suspect it'll be a long time. So in summary, if you're still using the OG power supply that came with your Commodore 64, I would highly recommend you stop doing that now and look at purchasing or building a modern power supply unit for your electronic bit of history. Original components for these machines are getting harder and harder to find every day and more expensive. The small investment in a new power supply unit today will likely pay for itself the first time you don't have to replace hard to find parts because your new PSU did not fry your Commodore 64. I will put a link to the PSU that I purchased from eBay in the description in case you're interested. I am not sponsored by any way from the makers of this power supply unit. I just happen to like their work. If you've purchased or used any other aftermarket PSUs, tell us about it in the comments section below. As always, thanks for watching.